During our family gathering at the lakeside, my nephew made a shocking announcement. He declared, people who depend on charity should wait their turn to eat. Everyone around him laughed at his cruel joke. Without saying another word, I set down my plate carefully and left the celebration immediately. Later that evening, my father sent me a message saying, "We urgently need your financial support for the business." My response was brief and final. I wrote back, "That will never happen again." The following morning, I sent out a single legal document, and their cheerful laughter quickly transformed into desperate tears. The oppressive humidity surrounding the lakeside estate felt like more than just weather conditions. It created a suffocating atmosphere that seemed to press down on everything during the 40th anniversary celebration for Horizon Freight. The heavy moisture trapped the scent of designer fragrances and the delicate sound of clinking champagne flutes in the thick summer air. My parents, Richard and Diane, had invested $44,000 to transform their sprawling lawn into an elaborate showcase of their supposed prosperity. Pristine white pavilions dotted the landscape. A classical string quartet performed in formal attire despite the sweltering heat, and they had ordered enough premium seafood to satisfy a small naval vessel. This was wealth as theater, carefully staged to convince potential investors that their company was flourishing, though I knew their financial statements told a very different story. I stood at the edge of the gathering, gripping a glass of tepid water in my hand. That placement represented my position within the family structure perfectly. I existed at the periphery, necessary for appearances, but completely irrelevant to any meaningful conversation. My older brother Andrew held the title of Chief Operating Officer, and he was currently entertaining guests near the open bar. He wore an expensive suit that cost more than my first automobile, laughing far too enthusiastically at some joke told by a prospective client. His wife, Christina, positioned herself beside him with a fixed, brilliant smile while her eyes constantly scanned the crowd for more important people to approach. I was extremely hungry because I had not eaten anything since breakfast that morning. I had spent the early hours reviewing portfolio adjustments for my actual professional clients, the ones who understood that I managed $220 million in investment assets. The family members at this party had no idea about my real work. They believed I was some kind of back-office administrative assistant who shuffled papers around. I walked toward the impressive buffet tables displaying their lavish spread of lobster tails, fresh oysters served on ice, and towering arrangements of shrimp. As I reached for an empty plate, my nephew Ethan, who was Andrew's 13-year-old son, deliberately stepped directly in front of me. This was not an accidental collision, but an intentional blockade. He positioned himself like a guard protecting the chilled prawns, wearing a smirk that was an exact replica of his father's expression. He examined me from head to toe, his eyes bright with the permission to be cruel that he had absorbed from the adults who raised him. "My dad says charity cases eat last," he announced loudly. His voice was not a whisper, but carried clearly over the soft music from the string quartet. Several nearby guests turned their heads to watch this humiliating scene unfold. I looked past Ethan to where Andrew stood watching the interaction. My brother had definitely heard what his son said to me. He looked directly at me, took a leisurely sip of his expensive scotch, and smirked with obvious satisfaction. He did not correct his son's behavior or offer any apology whatsoever. Instead, his silence served as complete validation of the cruelty. My parents were standing approximately 12 feet away from this confrontation, but they suddenly became intensely fascinated by the floral centerpieces at that precise moment. Time did not actually stop moving, but my entire perspective underwent a fundamental shift in those seconds. I did not feel the familiar sting of tears beginning or the hot flush of embarrassment that usually accompanied such humiliation. Instead, I experienced a cold and terrifying clarity about my situation. Most people think family trauma happens as a sudden break, a single catastrophic event that shatters everything instantly. That is not accurate at all. Family trauma operates more like a bank account that accumulates over many years. For 32 years of my life, I have been making regular deposits into a vast bank of tolerance. I deposited my silence when they completely forgot about my college graduation ceremony. I deposited my dignity when they openly mocked what they considered my boring career choice. I deposited my pride every single time they treated me like an inconvenient obligation they could not quite shake off. I had been paying compound interest on their ongoing disrespect, somehow assuming that eventually, if I paid enough emotional currency, I would finally be able to purchase their love and acceptance. But standing there looking at a child sneering at me with my brother's exact facial expression, I suddenly realized that the ledger was completely full. The account was severely overdrawn, and there was absolutely no more credit available to extend. I was not sad or hurt in that moment. I was simply finished doing business with them forever. Understood, I said softly but clearly. I set the empty plate back on the stack with a deliberate clicking sound. I did not look at Andrew again or glance at my parents. I turned around and walked purposefully toward the side gate of the property. Valerie, don't be so dramatic, Christina called out behind me, her voice high and shrill. He's just a kid being silly. I did not answer her or acknowledge the comment in any way. I kept walking steadily forward while the gravel crunched satisfyingly under my heels. I walked past the valet station, past the long rows of luxury vehicles, and got into my modest sedan. I sat there for a long moment in complete silence, letting the air conditioning blast against the sweat on my neck. I checked my phone and found no missed calls or text messages asking if I was okay. There was just the familiar silence I had always known from them. I put the car in gear and drove away from the estate, understanding that I was not just leaving a party behind. I was driving toward the biggest financial transaction of my entire life. The bank of family trauma was permanently closed, and tomorrow morning I was calling in every penny of the debt they owed me. My apartment was 40 minutes away from the lakeside estate, but it might as well have existed on a completely different planet. I owned a penthouse in the financial district, purchased entirely with cash 3 years earlier. The air inside was cool and filtered, carrying the subtle scent of lemon verbena and absolute silence. There were no family photographs displayed on any of the walls, just modern artwork and the city skyline glowing beautifully through floor-to-ceiling windows. This was the personal sanctuary I had built with the money they believed I did not have, doing the professional work they assumed I could not do. I kicked off my uncomfortable heels and poured myself a glass of cold water, noticing that my hand was perfectly steady. Sociologists have developed a specific term for siblings like me in dysfunctional family systems. They call us glass children. We are the ones born healthy into families completely consumed by a sick child, or in my particular case, the ones born competent into a family completely consumed by a golden child. We are not broken, so we never get fixed by anyone. We are not shiny, so we never get displayed proudly. We are just glass, transparent and functional, something people look through to see the things that actually matter to them. For 32 years of my existence, my parents had looked right through me as if I were invisible, focusing all their attention on admiring Andrew. Andrew, who had failed the bar examination twice consecutively. Andrew, who desperately needed an impressive chief operating officer title to feel important and successful. They polished him constantly until he gleamed, never once noticing that I was the structural integrity actually holding up their entire display case. They genuinely believed I was some kind of portfolio assistant or filing clerk, a boring paper pusher who balanced checkbooks for a living. The truth was dramatically different from their perception. I was a senior portfolio manager for a prestigious private wealth management firm. I did not balance personal checkbooks for anyone. I restructured massive estates for wealthy families. I did not manage thousands of dollars. I managed hundreds of millions of dollars for sophisticated clients. My personal net worth had grown to north of $22.2 million, accumulated through aggressive, high-risk trading strategies during my 20s. But the biggest trade of my entire life, and simultaneously the worst one emotionally, had been Horizon Freight. I sat down at my mahogany desk, feeling the cool wood under my fingertips. I opened my laptop computer, and the screen glowed brightly, illuminating the face of the woman my family did not actually know at all. 6 years ago, Horizon Freight had been technically bankrupt and facing liquidation. My father, Richard, had over-leveraged the entire truck fleet to purchase Andrew a flashy downtown headquarters building. The banks had called in all their loans immediately, and the company was literally days away from forced liquidation. I remembered the family dinner where my father wept openly into his scotch, terrified of the public shame and humiliation that would come. I could not bring myself to watch them fall apart completely. I was the glass child, and my function had always been to hold things together quietly. So I created a shell company called SteelBridge Capital through a trusted lawyer. I approached them as an anonymous angel investor offering salvation. I injected $4.6 million of my own money into their failing firm. I paid off all the toxic debt immediately. I upgraded their aging fleet of trucks. I saved them from complete financial ruin. In exchange for this rescue, SteelBridge Capital took 39% equity and a silent board seat. They never asked who was behind the curtain controlling SteelBridge. They were far too busy celebrating their own business genius for securing the funding. They took my money gratefully, patted themselves on the back repeatedly, and went right back to treating me like furniture in the room. I looked at the digital clock glowing on my desk. It showed 9:30 in the evening. My phone buzzed with an incoming text message from Richard. "Valerie, we need to talk tomorrow morning. The fleet expansion is over budget again. We might need a small personal loan to bridge the gap until next quarter arrives. Family helps family in difficult times." I stared at the screen for a long moment. He was asking for a bridge loan on top of the $5 million they did not know I had already given them years ago. They did not want a daughter in their lives. They wanted a liquidity provider and nothing more. I did not reply to his message. Instead, I opened my secure email client and composed a new message to Michael, my attorney and the public face of SteelBridge Capital. The subject line read, "Horizon Freight Liquidity Event. Michael, effective immediately, SteelBridge Capital is exercising its option under Section 4, Paragraph B of the shareholder agreement. We are formally requesting a full buyout of our 39% stake at current fair market value. If they cannot provide liquidity within 30 days, initiate the forced sale clause immediately. There is absolutely no room for negotiation. Proceed with all necessary actions." I hit send, and the swoosh of the email leaving my outbox was the quietest sound in the room. But I knew with absolute certainty it would land like a bomb in their lives. The glass child was not invisible anymore. I had just become the most visible problem in their entire existence. The next morning, the official notice from SteelBridge Capital hit my father's inbox at exactly 9 o'clock. Michael did not waste any time executing my instructions. The letter was a masterclass in corporate brevity and legal precision. It stated simply that the minority shareholder was exercising their liquidity rights under the contract. Horizon Logistics had 32 days to produce $13.7 million in cash to buy out the stake, or the entire company would be put up for sale to the highest bidder in the market. I was at my office reviewing a complicated merger for a technology client when my phone started buzzing repeatedly. I did not answer any of the calls. I let it vibrate rhythmically against the mahogany desk, serving as a reminder that the chaos had officially begun. At noon, I called Michael to get an update on the situation. "It's complete pandemonium over there," Michael said calmly and professionally. "Your father called me 5 times in the last hour alone. He's claiming this is a hostile act against the family. He's demanding to know who the investor is behind SteelBridge." I told him the investor prefers to remain silent as per the original agreement. I also reminded him that the contract he signed 6 years ago, the one he didn't read closely because he was too busy celebrating the cash influx, is completely ironclad. I swiveled my chair to look out at the city skyline. Do they have the money available? Not even close to that amount. Their liquidity is tied up in Andrew's vanity projects. They tried to call their line of credit at the bank an hour ago. The bank froze them immediately. Apparently, the rumor of a forced sale makes lenders extremely nervous. I hung up the phone, satisfied with the progress. The trap was perfectly set, and they were cornered like animals. And like any trapped animal facing extinction, they lashed out at the nearest available target. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, my father called me directly. I answered this time, curious what he would say. "Valerie," he said, his voice tight and vibrating with stress he was trying desperately to hide. "We have a serious situation at the company. It's a minor administrative issue with an investor. A minor administrative issue. He was about to lose everything he had built, and he was still spinning the narrative to sound manageable. "I'm busy, Dad," I said flatly. "What do you need from me?" "We need a bridge loan," he said quickly. "Just short term. The investor is being difficult, and we need to show some liquidity to the bank to get them to back off. We need $450,000 today." The audacity was absolutely breathtaking. He was asking me for money to fight against me. He wanted to use my own capital to stop me from collecting my own equity stake. "I can't do that, Dad," I said, keeping my voice completely flat and emotionless. "What do you mean you can't?" His voice rose sharply. "You have that job in the city. You must have savings. We're talking about the family legacy here, Valerie." Andrew is beside himself with worry. If we don't fix this, his children's future is at serious risk. There was crystal clear. Andrew's children. Ethan, the boy who had guarded the shrimp cocktail for me. The legacy of disrespect continuing to the next generation. "I don't have $450,000 to lend you," I lied smoothly. "And even if I did have it, I wouldn't lend it to a sinking ship." "Sinking ship." His voice rose sharply, the mask slipping completely. "How dare you say that? We built this company from nothing. We gave you everything. You're being incredibly selfish, Valerie. Family sticks together during a crisis. We don't abandon each other like this." "You abandoned me a long time ago, Dad," I said clearly. "You just didn't notice because I was still useful to you." I hung up the phone. 10 minutes later, a notification popped up on my social media feed. It was Christina, my sister-in-law, posting a photo of herself and Andrew looking stressed but brave. The caption read, "Hard times reveal true loyalty. Sad when people you thought you could count on forget where they came from. Family first, fake people last." I did not feel angry or upset. I did not feel the urge to comment or defend myself publicly. I just felt a cold sense of validation. They were not reflecting on their mistakes or behavior. They were doubling down on their entitlement. They truly believed that my role on this earth was to subsidize their arrogance indefinitely. They had absolutely no idea that the fake person they were insulting was the only person who could save them. And she had just decided to let them drown. The 30-day clock was ticking loudly, and I was the one holding the stopwatch. The 32 days passed in a blur of escalating desperation from them. My father called me 7 times total. Andrew showed up at my apartment building twice, but the doorman turned him away both times. I watched from my balcony as he yelled into his phone, pacing the sidewalk like a caged tiger. I imagine him calculating the cost of his designer suits versus the cost of his mortgage, realizing for the first time that the math did not work without the company credit card. Finally, the deadline arrived with no resolution. They had failed to raise the capital. The for sale clause was officially triggered. Steelbridge Capital moved quickly and efficiently. They executed the sale of Horizon Freight to a private equity firm, a ruthless outfit known for stripping assets and maximizing efficiency. The deal was done, and the papers were signed. My 39% stake was cashed out for $14.3 million. But there was one final piece of business to complete. The closing meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the morning at Steelbridge's headquarters on the 38th floor. My family had been summoned to surrender the keys to the kingdom. Michael told me they were expecting to meet the faceless investors to negotiate their exit packages. They thought they were walking into a standard corporate handover. They were completely wrong. I arrived at 10:15, fashionably late. I was wearing a tailored black suit with my hair pulled back in a severe bun. I looked every inch the shark I had become. The receptionist, who knew exactly who I was, nodded and buzzed me through immediately. I walked into the boardroom where my family was already waiting, huddled at the far end of the long mahogany table. Richard looked gray and exhausted, his shoulders slumped. Andrew was red-faced, arguing in a hushed whisper with Christina. Diane was staring out the window, looking lost and confused. When the door clicked shut behind me, they all looked up in surprise. "Valerie?" Andrew asked, his voice a mix of confusion and annoyance. "What are you doing here? This is a private meeting. You can't be here." "Actually," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. I'm the only one who needs to be here. I walked to the head of the table and pulled out the chairman's chair, then sat down in it. Silence fell over the room, absolute and suffocating. "What is this?" Richard whispered. He looked from me to Michael, who was standing by the window with a file in his hands. "This," I said clearly, "is the liquidity event you asked for." "I don't understand," Diane said, her voice trembling with confusion. "Steelbridge Capital is me," I finished. "It always has been. The $5 million that saved this company 5 years ago, that was mine. The capital you used to buy the new fleet, mine. The salary you paid yourself, Andrew, while mocking my boring job, mine." Andrew stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "You're lying. You're just an investment director. You don't have that kind of money." "Sit down, Andrew," I said without raising my voice. I did not have to. The authority in my tone was absolute. He blinked, stunned, and slowly sat back down. "I managed high-risk assets for a decade," I said. "I built a fortune while you were building a facade. And when you needed saving, I saved you anonymously because I knew if you knew it was me, you'd never respect the money. You'd treat it like an allowance." I opened the file in front of me. "But you didn't respect it anyway. You treated my capital like a personal piggy bank. And when you insulted me to my face in front of your son, you breached the only contract that mattered." "We're family," Richard pleaded, his eyes wet with tears. "Valerie, please. We can fix this. We can make this right." "This isn't personal, Richard," I said, echoing the words he had used 1,000 times to dismiss my feelings. "It's just business, and the business is concluded. The company has been sold. The wire transfer hit my account this morning." "Sold?" Christina gasped. "But what about Andrew's job? What about our shares?" "Your shares are being bought out at a discount due to the debt load," I said coldly. "And as for your jobs, the new owners will be conducting a full restructuring. I imagine the position of executive vice president who does nothing will be the first to go." I stood up and looked at them, really looked at them. The golden child, the narcissist, the enabler. They looked small and terrified. They looked exactly like people who had just realized that the furniture in the room was worth more than they were. "The meeting is adjourned," I said. I turned and walked out without looking back. I did not need to. The sound of my brother weeping was the only closing statement I needed. The silence in the boardroom was heavy, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning. My family sat in stunned paralysis, processing the fact that their scapegoat was their landlord, their bank, and their executioner. But I saw the shift in their eyes as the shock began fading, replaced by a desperate, greedy calculation. They were doing the math, and I could see it on Andrew's face. He was thinking, "Okay, we lost the company, but it's sold for $14 million. My 16% stake is worth nearly $2.2 million. I can start over. I can still be rich." My father was straightening his tie, attempting to regain some semblance of dignity. "Well," he cleared his throat, "if the sale is finalized, we should discuss the distribution of the net proceeds. I assume the wire transfers will be initiated today." I leaned back in the chairman's chair, steepling my fingers. "That brings us to the second item on the agenda, the transition." "Transition?" Christina asked, her voice shrill. "You said the company was sold. We just want our checks." "The new owners, the private equity firm, have strict requirements for acquisition," I explained calmly. "They require a clean balance sheet, no toxic assets, no unexplained liabilities. And to ensure this, they have appointed an external transition controller to audit the books before any final payouts are released." "Who is the controller?" Richard asked, narrowing his eyes. "Me," I said. I slid a new stack of files across the mahogany table. They were not legal contracts this time. They were expense reports spanning years. "For the past week, I've been conducting a forensic audit of Horizon's operating expenses," I said. "And I found some fascinating discrepancies." I opened the first folder. "Andrew, let's start with you. Last year you charged $68,000 to the company card for client development in Turks and Caicos." Andrew paled. That was a retreat for strategy. There were no clients in Cabo, Andrew, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. There was just you, Christina, and a five-star resort. That is classified as embezzlement. I turned the page. And the company vehicle lease, a luxury SUV for Christina. She doesn't work for Horizon. That's another $1,200 a month in misappropriated funds. We needed a safe car for the kids, Christina stammered. Then you should have paid for it, I countered. I turned to my father. He was staring at the table, refusing to meet my gaze. Richard, consulting fees paid to a shell company registered in your name, $185,000 over 3 years, plus the country club membership, plus the business dinners that always seem to happen on your anniversary. I founded this company, he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. I am entitled to perks. You are entitled to a salary, I corrected him. You are not entitled to treat the operating capital as a personal slush fund, especially not when you are asking investors for bridge loans to keep the lights on. I closed the file. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Here is the situation. The private equity firm has a clawback clause. All misappropriated funds must be repaid before any equity is distributed. I have calculated the total unauthorized spending by the three of you over the last 5 years. It comes to quite a significant number. I picked up a pair of scissors from the desk organizer. I reached for the small pile of corporate credit cards that sat in the center of the table, the symbols of their status, their power, their ability to live a life they had not earned. When we deduct the debt you owe the company from the value of your shares, I said, picking up Andrew's platinum card, the balance is 0. I cut the card in half. Snip. Actually, I amended, picking up my father's card. It's slightly negative, but I'm feeling generous. I'll write off the difference. Snip. You're leaving us with nothing, Andrew whispered. He looked like a child who had dropped his ice cream. But the house, the tuition. We spent the payout in our heads already. Then you made a bad investment, I said. There is no payout. There are no millions. There is just the debt you accrued while pretending to be rich. I swept the plastic shards into a small pile. You wanted to run a family business, I told them. But you forgot the most important rule of business. You have to pay for what you take. I watched them crumble. It was not a sudden collapse like a building imploding. It was a slow, agonizing slide into reality. Andrew was the first to break completely. He stared at the pieces of his platinum card on the mahogany table, his hands trembling violently. The man who had sneered at me at the garden party, who had taught his son that charity cases eat last, was gone. In his place was a terrified boy who did not know how to go home and tell his wife that the lease on the SUV was canceled. Christina is going to leave me, he whispered, the words leaking out of him. If I don't have the money, she's going to take Ethan and leave. I looked at Christina. She did not contradict him. She just stared at the wall, her face pale, calculating her own survival. She was not comforting him. She was already distancing herself from the failure. Then there was Richard, my father, the patriarch who had built a kingdom on debt and bluster. He slumped in his chair, looking suddenly ancient. The redness had drained from his face, leaving it gray and slack. Valerie, he croaked. You can't do this. I'm the chairman. You are the chairman, I corrected. Now you're a liability. There's a concept in psychology called a narcissistic injury. It occurs when a person with an inflated sense of self-importance confronts a reality that contradicts their delusion. It is not just disappointment. It is a complete psychological disintegration. For 28 years, my family had built their identities on a simple foundation. They were the kings, and I was the servant. They were the success, and I was the disappointment. By revealing that I was the architect of their survival, I had not just taken their money. I had destroyed their reality. They could not process it. Their brains were short-circuiting because the hierarchy they worshipped had just inverted. They were not crying because they had hurt me. They were crying because they realized I was the only one who had ever held any real power, and they had spent decades spitting on me. Please, Richard whispered. He reached out a shaking hand, trying to touch my arm. Just give us the transition period. Just 6 months. Let us keep the cards. Let us figure something out. We'll pay you back, I swear it. It was pathetic. The man who had threatened to cut off my tuition, who had ignored me at parties, who had treated me like a ghost, was now begging me for a credit line. I looked at his hand. I did not pull away. I just did not react. I felt nothing. All that was left was a profound clinical pity. They were so small. Without their props, without the company cars and the country club memberships and the titles, they were empty shells. I can't give you the transition period, Dad, I said quietly, because you would just spend it trying to look like you were winning. You don't know how to do anything else. I stood up and gathered my files, the evidence of their greed and my competence. Where are you going? Andrew asked, panic rising in his voice. Valerie, wait. What do we do? You figure it out, I said. I walked to the door. Behind me, I heard my father sob, a harsh, jagged sound. Valerie, he yelled. I'm your father. I paused with my hand on the handle. I did not turn around. I know, I said. And that's why I'm firing you. I opened the door and walked out into the cool, quiet hallway. I left them in the boardroom with the cut-up plastic and the ruins of their egos. The air out here was cleaner. It tasted like freedom. The deal closed 4 days later. The wire transfer hit my account at 9 o'clock in the morning sharp. $14,300,000. It was a staggering number, enough to buy a fleet of yachts or a private island. But I did not buy any of that. I bought a house instead. It was a small mid-century modern place tucked away in the mountains, 3 hours north of the city, and a lifetime away from the humidity of a lake. It had no guest room for ungrateful relatives. It had no banquet hall for performative parties. It just had a wide porch where I could drink my coffee in silence, listening to the wind in the trees instead of the whispers of people who looked down on me. A month after the sale, a letter arrived. It was handwritten on cheap stationery. Horizon letterhead was a thing of the past. It was from Richard. Valerie, it read, I see now that you were the one holding us up. I'm sorry. I only realized your value when I had to pay for it. I read it once. I did not feel a surge of vindication or a pang of guilt. I just felt done. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer with the old tax returns and expired warranties. I did not reply. I did not need to. The transaction was complete. That evening, I made a simple dinner of grilled salmon and asparagus. I sat at my table, looking out at the mountains turning purple in the twilight. There was no one to serve, no one to wait for, no one to block me from the table. I took a bite. It tasted perfect. The charity case was eating first.